In just 12 hours, a great American city fell into chaos. Los Angeles, once a symbol of dreams, was swallowed by fire, smoke, and fear. Windows shattered, sirens screamed, and as leaders hesitated, one man stood where no one else dared. J.D. Vance. He walked through the burning streets, past overturned cars and broken glass, searching for the truth. A truth hidden beneath the ash. A truth Gavin Newsom tried to bury that night. What really happened? Why did the city burn while help stood waiting? Now we take you into that storm, into the heart of a battle not just for a city, but for America's soul. And as we begin, remember, this is a dramatized account inspired by real events, meant to capture the spirit, the courage, and the questions that still haunt us. The people, the places, they may be fictionalized, but the emotions, the struggle for truth, those are real. Stay with us as we walk together through the ashes, searching for answers that still matter today. It began as a night like any other in Los Angeles, a city of lights, of dreams, of promises. But tonight, those lights weren't neon signs or glimmering towers. Tonight, Los Angeles glowed with fire. Sirens screamed through the dark, their echoes bouncing off empty streets and crumbling facades. Red and blue lights painted the smoke-choked sky, but they did nothing to pierce the haze that hung heavy over the city. Buildings downtown burned like torches, their windows shattered, their histories consumed by flame. On Main Street, a small grocery store owner, a man who had built his life from nothing, stood frozen in the doorway of his shop. His hands trembled, clutching a baseball bat as shadows moved toward him. The glass of his storefront was spiderwebbed with cracks, ready to give at any second. Behind him, shelves of goods, his livelihood, seemed to cower in the flickering light. His eyes darted between the advancing mob and the bat in his grip, as if calculating whether courage or survival would win. Down the block, a woman dragged her teenage son away from the chaos. He struggled, wanting to film what he saw, wanting to capture history on his phone. But his mother knew better. History that night was nothing to celebrate. It was something to survive. And everywhere, there was sound. The deafening crash of windows as they burst inward. The sickening crunch of tires as cars were overturned and set ablaze. The ragged, breathless shouts of police trying to hold their line. News footage played on screens in bar windows and on phones held by trembling hands. The anchors' voices tried to mask fear with professionalism, reporting on rioters clashing with officers, on districts that had lost control. But the images spoke louder. Masked figures hurling bricks, flames swallowing parked cars, barricades collapsing under the weight of the angry, the desperate, the lawless. And then, the SUV, large, black, unmarked. It rolled slowly through the smoke, headlights cutting narrow paths of clarity in a world blurred by chaos. Inside, J.D. Vance gripped the wheel tighter than he realized. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the carnage outside. He pulled to the side of the street, engine idling, and stared out the window. A burning flag toppled from a building above, drifting past like a fallen star. J.D. watched it fall, watched it hiss into the puddle at the curb. His inner voice was calm, too calm, as if the weight of the moment had settled so deep it silenced everything else. This is what happens when leadership hides, when good men are told to stand down, when the law is mocked and the mob decides what's right. Another explosion. A transformer blew somewhere in the distance, plunging a neighborhood into total darkness. The city seemed to inhale with that blast, and for a moment, J.D. felt as if even the night itself was holding its breath. If we lose tonight, he thought, we don't just lose a city, we lose who we are. We lose the promise of this country. And if that happens, if we let it happen, how do we ever explain it to the children who will wake to ashes? A police radio crackled nearby, an officer's voice breaking through. We're getting overrun. They're at the barricades. Backup requested. God help us. J.D. closed his eyes for a beat, feeling the enormity of the moment press against him like the heat of the fires outside. When he opened them, his gaze hardened. I didn't come here to watch history burn, he whispered to no one. I came here to stop it. And somewhere in the smoke, a shadow moved. Not part of the mob, not part of the chaos. A figure watching him? A threat? JD's eyes locked onto it, but the smoke swallowed it again. Who else was out there tonight, he wondered. And what were they willing to do? The smoke hadn't yet cleared from JD's windshield when he eased the SUV through a side street and disappeared into the shadow of a government building. A discreet entrance swung open, and in the glow of emergency lights, figures emerged. Uniforms, badges, weary faces that had already seen too much tonight. The city's roar faded behind thick walls, replaced by the low murmur of men and women trying to hold the line as their world burned. The room JD entered was small, concrete, functional. A folding table cluttered with radios, maps smeared with soot, and half-drunk cups of cold coffee marked the nerve center of a desperate fight. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and worry. "Senator," one of the officers said, his voice hoarse. A Marine captain stood at attention out of habit, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. An FBI agent rubbed his temples, as if trying to push back the pounding inside his head. Border Patrol officers leaned in from the corners, alert, waiting. JD nodded silently, taking it all in. The bruised pride, the fatigue, the weight of duty pressing down on everyone in that room. And then the voices began. "Sir, we're stretched thin. Our guys haven't had backup in hours. We've lost the south side of downtown, completely overrun. They're setting fires faster than we can contain them. We've got reports of Molotov cocktails, stolen weapons, even a police cruiser hijacked. The governor's office won't authorize more force. They're telling us to stand down, let local officials negotiate. But there's no one left to negotiate with out there." JD listened, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles blanched. He scanned their faces. Faces of men and women sworn to protect a city that seemed to have turned on itself. And beneath their words, beneath the tactical updates and grim assessments, JD heard what none of them said out loud. "We feel abandoned." For a moment, the weight of it threatened to crush him, the sorrow for what had already been lost, the anger at leadership that hesitated while citizens bled, and the quiet determination that always rose within him when no one else would act. He drew a slow breath, feeling the sting of smoke in his lungs. "Look at me," JD said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. The room stilled, every eye turned to him. "You are not alone tonight." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. In their simplicity, they carried the full force of what JD had come here to do. "I didn't come to watch from a safe distance. I came to stand with you. We will not leave the city to burn. We will not let good officers, good people, fight this battle with their hands tied. I promise you that." And as JD spoke, something shifted. The radio static seemed to soften. The weight in the room lifted, just slightly, replaced by the first flicker of resolve the officers had felt all night. The captain straightened, his voice stronger now. "What are your orders, sir?" JD didn't answer right away. He looked down at the maps, at the pins marking lost ground, at the streets where families hid in fear. He felt the enormity of the moment settle on his shoulders, and still, he welcomed it. "We take back the night," JD said quietly, "one block at a time." And as the room began to move, radios crackling, plans forming, JD allowed himself one last glance at the smoke-dark city beyond the window. There was no turning back now. The room hummed with tension, the kind that settled in after orders were given but before action began. Maps shifted, radios crackled, and boots moved swiftly across the floor. But JD stood still for a heartbeat longer, his eyes locked on the grim city beyond the window, as if searching for a sign, or perhaps the resolve to do what came next. He turned, his voice low but firm. "Patch me through. I need to speak. Not just to this room, to the country." The Marine captain hesitated. "Sir, the networks, no clearance." JD cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. "Then make them listen. Tonight isn't about clearance. It's about truth." Within minutes, a small media crew, stationed nearby to cover the unfolding crisis, was rushed into the building. JD stood before a battered podium, no teleprompter, no prepared statement. Just a man facing down the storm, determined that his voice would carry where others had gone silent. The cameras flickered to life. Somewhere beyond the smoke and barricades, millions of Americans, some huddled in their homes, others glued to televisions in diners, fire stations, living rooms, leaned forward. The image on screen was stark. J.D. Vance, sleeves rolled, face shadowed with fatigue and firelight, eyes burning with conviction. "I didn't come here tonight to give a speech," J.D. began, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "I came here because this city, this great American city, is on fire. And while its people cry out for help, their leaders hide behind closed doors." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle, the silence more powerful than any shout. "I have walked these streets tonight. I have seen shopkeepers defending what little they have left with their bare hands. I have seen mothers sheltering children from flames that weren't theirs to start. I have seen officers, brave and outnumbered, holding the line while those in power tell them to stand down. And I ask you, America, how did we get here?" JD's voice grew stronger, rising with the fury he could no longer contain. "Governor Gavin Newsom, where are you? Where were you when the city burned? When the mob you emboldened, through cowardice, through inaction, turned on the very people you swore to protect?" The camera zoomed slightly, capturing the fire in his eyes, the clenched fist at his side. "This isn't about politics. This isn't about party. This is about right and wrong, about law and lawlessness, about whether we let America's great cities fall one by one, or whether we stand and say no more." Somewhere off-screen, producers whispered urgently, worried about the unfiltered rage spilling into the airwaves. But no one cut the feed. No one dared. JD drew a breath, his voice lowering, but somehow heavier for it. "If no one else will stand for this city, I will." For a long moment, the image of JD remained, silent, as if the camera itself was unwilling to turn away. Then the screen faded to black, leaving only the echo of his words in living rooms, bars, and hearts across the nation. Inside the command room, the officers and agents exchanged glances. Something electric had shifted. The political showdown had begun, and J.D. Vance had fired the first blow. And as the night pressed on, the nation waited, breath held, to see who would rise to answer him. The final echoes of J.D.'s televised address still seemed to hang in the air, the weight of his words settling over the city like the smoke that choked its streets. As J.D. stepped back from the podium, the command room erupted in activity. Phones rang, radios crackled, messages flooded in. Not from Washington, not from party leaders, but from the forgotten corners of California, small towns, neighborhoods clinging to order on the edge of chaos. J.D. grabbed the nearest handset as a voice broke through, heavy with desperation. "Senator Vance, this is Mayor Wilson, Westfield. We need help. Looters are moving through our main street. We have 2 deputies trying to hold them off. I've got families sheltering in the elementary school. Please, we can't do this alone." Another call came, then another. Mayors, pastors, community leaders, their voices blending into a chorus of fear and exhaustion. J.D. listened, one after another, each plea cutting deeper than the last. "We've barricaded the community center, but they're breaking through. The volunteer fire department's trying to stop a blaze at the clinic. We're out of water pressure. They're coming through the orchards now. We can see their lights. My people are scared." Each call was a reminder that this wasn't just Los Angeles burning. This was a state unraveling at the seams. J.D. turned to his aides, his jaw set. "Get me the governor's office. Now!" Minutes felt like hours before the line connected. A voice, polished, detached, came through. "Senator Vance, this is Deputy Chief of Staff Herrera. The governor is monitoring the situation. What can I relay?" J.D. kept his voice steady, though his hands trembled with restrained fury. "Relay this. Cities are burning. People are begging for help. I need authorization for immediate federal reinforcements. Marines, National Guard. We can stabilize this before dawn if we move now." There was a pause. Too long. When Herrera spoke again, the words were like ice. "Senator, we appreciate your concern, but the governor believes in local control. Bringing in federal forces could escalate tensions. We ask that you respect our strategy. JD stared at the phone, unable to believe what he was hearing. Around him, the command room was alive with voices. Officers reporting worsening conditions, neighborhoods falling, officers pinned down with no way out. On the screen above, live footage showed a patrol car trapped in a narrow alley, surrounded by rioters pounding on its doors. The officers inside radioed for help, their faces pale in the flickering light of nearby fires. JD clenched his fist, the weight of betrayal settling heavy on his chest. Local control? This isn't control. This is surrender. He took a slow breath, forcing his voice into a low, dangerous calm. Tell the governor this isn't about control. It's about saving lives. And if he won't act, I will. He dropped the receiver into its cradle, the sharp click echoing through the room like a gunshot. For a beat, the room fell silent. Officers, agents, aides all watching him. And then with quiet determination, JD turned to the maps once more. The governor might have abandoned the field, but JD Vance had not. The click of the receiver still echoed in JD's ears as he strode out of the command room. He could feel the weight of every desperate voice that had reached him. The small-town mayors, the sheriffs, the parents and shopkeepers who had called him because they had no one else left to call. The betrayal of the governor's office burned in his chest, but beneath that fire, something colder, clearer took hold. Resolve. JD didn't hesitate. Get the press, he ordered an aide. Every outlet, every camera that can still broadcast. We do this in the open. Within the hour, under a bruised dawn sky streaked with smoke, JD stood on the cracked steps of City Hall. The building, normally imposing, now loomed like a hollow shell. Windows shattered, banners torn. The square below was crowded with journalists, their faces pale in the gray morning light. Their equipment coated in ash. The air was thick with the smell of burned wood and melted plastic. Sirens wailed somewhere far off, but here, in this battered heart of Los Angeles, there was only the hush of expectation and the steady hum of cameras broadcasting live to a nation on edge. JD's voice carried in that silence, steady as the city's heartbeat. I didn't ask you here for politics, he began, his eyes sweeping the crowd, his words measured but heavy with emotion. I asked you here because the people of this city, this state, deserve better than what they've been given. He gestured behind him, toward the wreckage of City Hall, toward the burned-out husks of buildings that lined the street. Look around. This isn't just a city in crisis. This is a city abandoned. Families trapped in homes that no longer feel safe. Businesses built over decades reduced to ashes in a single night. Officers, firefighters, first responders, fighting without support, without backup, without the leadership they deserve. JD's voice rose, raw with truth. I have called Governor Newsom. I have pleaded for reinforcements, for action, for the courage to stand up and face this together, and he has refused. So today I'm challenging him. Come stand here with me, right here on these steps. Let the people see who leads them. Let them hear what he will do. I won't shout across press releases. I won't argue over social media. I will stand where the fire is hottest. That's where leadership belongs. A murmur ran through the press corps, a ripple of energy. The cameras zoomed in, the microphones edged closer. Somewhere, across televisions and phones, Americans leaned forward, drawn by the force of the moment. JD's eyes burned with the weight of all he had seen, all he refused to let continue. I don't speak tonight as a senator. I speak as a citizen, as a father, as a man who refuses to watch a great city fall while those in power tweet from safe offices and wait for someone else to act. If Governor Newsom won't come, if he won't lead, then let the nation see it, and let the nation remember it. For a long beat, the square held its breath. Smoke swirled at JD's feet, the rising sun catching the edge of shattered glass and turning it to fire. And as JD stepped back from the microphones, the challenge hung heavy in the morning air. A gauntlet thrown, a battle line drawn. The square remained still long after JD's voice fell silent, as if the city itself was weighing his words. Cameras kept rolling, reporters whispered into microphones, But no official came to the steps. No governor, no aide. Only the rising sun and the quiet defiance of a man who had dared to stand where leadership should have been. Inside the state capitol, Gavin Newsom's inner circle scrambled. Phones rang off the hook, screens glowed with urgent messages, aides argued in hushed tones. They debated statements, drafted releases, weighed risks. But even as the city smoldered, no direct appearance was scheduled. The governor's office chose caution, or what they called caution, while the streets cried out for presence. And in that vacuum, something began to stir. It started with a few: a shopkeeper who stepped out of his ruined store holding a tattered American flag, a mother who lifted her toddler onto her shoulders to see JD's speech replayed on a neighbor's battery-powered television, a group of firefighters off shift, standing together on a scorched sidewalk, nodding as they listened. By midday, the city was no longer silent. People gathered, first dozens, then hundreds, waving flags, holding homemade signs, chanting JD's name. They weren't there for politics. They were there because someone had seen them, heard them, when no one else would. JD didn't retreat to offices or meeting rooms. He walked the streets, boots crunching over glass and ash. He shook hands with men whose livelihoods lay in ruins. He knelt beside women who wept over what they'd lost. His security detail kept close, but JD barely noticed. He was where he needed to be. In one burned-out neighborhood, a man stood waiting, an older figure in a faded army jacket, his stance as straight as the years would allow. The man's hands were calloused, his eyes tired but clear. JD approached, offering his hand. The veteran took it, his grip firm, his voice low but steady. "This is the first time I've felt seen," he said. The words hit JD harder than any shouted praise or chant. In them was the weight of countless nights ignored, of communities passed over, of promises made and broken. JD nodded, his throat tight. "I see you, and I won't look away." The veteran gave a small, grateful smile, then stepped aside as JD moved on. The cameras caught the moment, broadcasting it live, and across the nation, hearts stirred, some in agreement, others in anger, but none untouched. And still no governor appeared. By evening, the city felt different, divided. On one side, a growing movement, not of politicians, but of people, bruised, grieving, determined. On the other, silence from those who should have led, punctuated only by carefully worded statements read from safe distances. JD paused at a street corner as dusk fell, watching as volunteers began clearing debris, as neighbors shared what little water and food they had left, as flags were raised from broken windows. This wasn't the end of the storm, not yet. But for the first time in days, the city felt as if it had found its voice. And as JD looked out over the battered streets, he knew the next move wasn't his alone to make. It belonged to every citizen who had decided that night they would no longer be invisible. Night fell heavy over Los Angeles, but the city did not sleep. The chants of the people who had rallied behind JD Vance during the day faded into the deeper sounds of a city still under siege, glass cracking underfoot, the low groan of buildings too damaged to stand, the far-off boom of another explosion. Someone's shop, someone's home, lost to the night. JD stood at the edge of the staging area, where Marines gathered in tight groups, checking weapons, radios, gear. Their faces were streaked with sweat and soot, their eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that clung to them. One officer approached JD, his voice steady but urgent. "Senator, we're ready to move. If you're sure about coming along, stay close. We don't have room for mistakes out there tonight." JD nodded. There was no hesitation. "I'm not here to watch. Let's go." The convoy rolled out, a line of armored vehicles cutting through the smoke like steel ghosts. JD rode with the Marines, the rhythmic thrum of the engine beneath him, the night pressing close on all sides. They moved through streets that were little more than open wounds now. Burned-out cars lined the curbs. Shop fronts gaped like broken teeth, and glass glittered in the gutter like a field of stars fallen to earth. JD kept his eyes on the city outside, his mind turning over what he'd seen, what he still couldn't look away from. The veteran's words echoed, "This is the first time I felt seen." That simple sentence weighed heavier than the body armor he wore. The convoy slowed, then stopped. A Marine sergeant motioned them forward on foot, their boots crunching on debris. The air was thick with smoke and the tang of burned plastic, making every breath a test of will. Somewhere ahead, gunfire cracked. Short, sharp bursts that made the night feel alive and dangerous. Suddenly, shouts broke through the haze. A Marine squad ahead of them had come under attack. A small group of rioters, emboldened by darkness, had ambushed the patrol. JD saw it happen as they rounded the corner. An officer down, blood seeping onto the cracked pavement. Two others firing controlled bursts to hold back the mob. Instinct overrode fear. JD sprinted forward with two Marines, dropping to his knees beside the wounded officer. The man's face was pale, his breathing ragged. "We've got you," JD said, his voice low, steady. He grabbed one arm, a Marine took the other, and together they dragged the officer back toward the safety of the convoy. Bullets sparked off nearby walls. The heat of a burning car seared the side of JD's face as they passed. Every instinct screamed at him to run faster, to get clear, to find cover. But deeper than fear was the certainty that he couldn't leave these streets. Not now, not ever. When they reached the armored vehicle, JD helped lift the officer inside, the man's blood staining his sleeves. He paused, chest heaving, heart racing. "You're in it now," JD thought. "No more speeches, no more cameras. Just this. The fight, the fire, the cost." He wiped sweat from his brow, smearing ash across his skin, and turned back toward the shattered streets. The night wasn't over. Neither was his duty. The echoes of gunfire faded as JD helped the wounded officer into the armored vehicle, but the night's tension thickened rather than eased. The city still burned, the air still pulsed with danger, and somewhere, far from the smoke and the broken glass, Governor Gavin Newsom finally spoke. JD heard it first through the radio static, the clipped voice of a news anchor breaking in over emergency channels. The broadcast flickered on a cracked screen in a nearby shop front, the governor framed against the safe, polished backdrop of his office, his suit crisp, his tone controlled. "We are deeply concerned," Newsom said, "about the presence of federal forces on our streets. These measures, led in part by Senator Vance, have not calmed the violence. They have escalated it. I call on all parties to de-escalate, to respect the authority of local law enforcement, and to work toward peaceful resolution. I urge Senator Vance to reconsider his actions before more harm is done." JD stared at the screen, ash settling on his shoulders like snow. His heart pounded, but not from the fear of gunfire. It was fury, cold, righteous fury, that Newsom would stand behind polished glass and speak of peace while men bled in the streets. He turned to the officers and Marines who stood waiting, their faces shadowed in the glow of nearby fires. His voice was low but carried the force of conviction. "He's hiding while others bleed." The words needed no amplification. They spread among the ranks like a spark through dry grass. JD took a breath, steadying himself, knowing what had to come next. The risk, the blowback, but also the necessity. He looked at the maps, at the lines they had tried to hold, at the neighborhoods still under siege, and he spoke the words that would change the night. "We secure the key areas. Tonight. We protect what we can, where we can. Federal forces move now. No more waiting for permission that will never come." There was a pause, the weight of his decision sinking in. A Marine officer nodded, then barked orders into a radio. Units shifted, plans set in motion, boots hitting pavement as the force divided to reclaim ground. It was a bold move, one that would ignite controversy by morning. Commentators would call it reckless, unlawful. Pundits would debate the limits of authority, but none of that mattered now. What mattered were the lives at stake, the streets still burning, the people still trapped behind doors they prayed would hold. JD watched as the first units moved out, his face grim but resolute. Inside, the storm of thoughts raged. There will be consequences. But what's the alternative? Stand down? Watch more fall? Not tonight. The governor's image faded from the broken screen, replaced by chaotic scenes of the city. Fires, sirens, flashes of light where lawlessness met resistance. And as JD stood amid the smoke and the ruin, he knew this wasn't just a standoff between two men. It was a test of what kind of nation they would be when the dawn finally came. The orders had been given, the forces deployed. Now, as the first fragile light of dawn broke over the battered city, JD found himself walking alone through the heart of downtown Los Angeles. The night's fires still smoldered in corners of the streets, sending up tendrils of smoke that caught the pale sun, painting the morning in hues of golden gray. Every step crunched on glass, on charred wood, on the debris of what had been. The city felt hollow in those early hours. No chants, no sirens, just the low hum of distant engines and the soft crackle of dying flames. JD's boots echoed on the empty pavement as he passed storefronts that only hours ago had stood defiant against the storm. Now they were gutted, their insides laid bare to the world, their signs blackened by soot. He paused at one, a family-owned diner, its name barely visible through the ash. A child's drawing, pinned in the window, had survived the flames. JD stared at it, a smiling sun over a stick-figure family. The innocence of it ached in his chest. The city had fought for its soul last night, and dawn offered no clear answer as to whether it had won or lost. JD's thoughts turned inward, heavy with the weight of decisions made. He saw again the faces of the officers and Marines as they set out. He heard again the governor's voice, distant and hollow. He felt again the pull of responsibility, not just for orders given, but for what those orders meant. He rounded a corner and stopped. Spray painted across the cracked facade of City Hall were 5 simple words. "Where were you, Governor?" The letters dripped black against the stone, stark in the rising sun. JD stood there, reading the question over and over, as if its answer might somehow be found in the morning light. But there was no answer, not yet. A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of smoke and something else. Hope, maybe, or just the clean promise of a new day trying to break through. JD drew a slow breath, letting the air fill his lungs, feeling the sting of it. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun fought its way above the skyline, casting long shadows between the ruins. His fists clenched at his sides, not in anger this time, but in resolve. "This city will not see another night like that," JD murmured. The words meant as much for himself as for anyone who might hear. "Not while I still stand." The promise hung there, fragile as the dawn itself, but it was a beginning. JD took one last look at the graffiti, at the broken city, at the streets that still smoldered. And then he turned, walking back toward his team, toward the fight that wasn't over, toward the day that would define what came next. Behind him, the city stirred. Not yet healed, not yet whole, but not lost. Not yet. Dawn gave way to a tense, uneasy morning. The city awoke to the scars of the night. Scorched buildings, boarded windows, streets littered with the remnants of chaos. But beneath the ash and debris, something else simmered. The demand for answers. Across radios, televisions, and social feeds, the public's voice rose as one. They had seen the speeches, the fires, the blood. Now they wanted to see their leaders, together, accountable, face to face. Under mounting pressure from citizens, mayors, and even members of his own party, Governor Gavin Newsom relented. By midday, it was announced he would meet J.D. Vance at a live, nationally broadcast town hall that evening. The venue was hastily chosen, a university auditorium on the city's edge, its exterior battered but intact. Inside, the air crackled with tension as citizens, community leaders, first responders, and reporters filled the seats. Cameras captured every angle. The nation watched, breath held as 2 men stepped onto the stage, each carrying the weight of a city in crisis. JD's sleeves were rolled, his face lined from sleepless nights. Newsom's suit was immaculate, but his eyes betrayed strain. The moderator barely finished the first question before the debate ignited. JD wasted no time. His voice was clear, unwavering. "Governor, last night over 50 blocks burned. We saw assaults on officers, looting, arson, destruction on a scale this city hasn't witnessed in decades. Where was the leadership to stop it?" Newsom's response was polished, but edged with frustration. "Senator, this isn't about pointing fingers in a moment of grief. The heavy-handed tactics you endorsed inflame tensions. The images of federal forces on our streets did not calm the situation. They worsened it. JD shook his head, leaning toward the mic, his voice rising. You speak of tactics? Let's speak of numbers. Over 100 businesses destroyed, dozens hospitalized, families left homeless overnight. This wasn't the result of federal action. This was the result of federal inaction for too long, of local leadership too timid to act when it mattered most. The audience murmured, the tension in the room tightening like a drawn bow. Newsom tried to steer the conversation back. We need community healing, not division. You brought division when we needed unity. JD's eyes flashed. He paused, letting the silence build, letting every person in that room lean in. Then he spoke, his words cutting through the noise. You didn't lose this city tonight. You lost it long ago. The night only revealed it. A gasp rippled through the audience. Even the cameras seemed to draw closer, capturing the weight of the moment. Newsom opened his mouth to reply, but no sound came at first. The blow had landed. For a beat, the two men locked eyes. The stage transformed into a battleground, not of fists or flames, but of truth and reckoning. JD straightened, his voice now low but resolute. We can argue all night, Governor, but the city burns either way. The question is, what will we do tomorrow to stop it from burning again? And as the auditorium held its breath, the debate raged on. A clash not just of men, but of visions for what could be saved and what had already been lost. The debate's words still echoed through the auditorium, but their true impact unfolded far beyond the walls of that battered university hall. Across the nation, millions leaned closer to their screens, not for spectacle, but because, for the first time in days, they heard voices that spoke to their pain, their fear, and their hope. In a diner in a small town in the Midwest, truckers, farmers, and retirees sat shoulder to shoulder, their coffee forgotten as JD's words rang out. An old farmer, with hands rough from decades of work, muttered to no one in particular. Finally, someone saying it plain. His neighbor, a younger man, nodded silently, eyes locked on the television bolted above the counter. At a military base in Texas, Marines gathered in the common room, the glow of the screen casting their faces in flickering light. The debate had started as background noise during their meal, but as JD spoke of duty, of the cost of inaction, the room grew quiet. One young sergeant leaned forward, elbows on his knees, whispering, "He's out there with them. He gets it." In the heart of Los Angeles, in an apartment darkened by the city's power outages, a family huddled around a battery-powered radio, the voices from the town hall filling the room. The mother, holding her youngest close, felt tears burn her eyes as she heard JD's challenge to the governor. "Maybe they'll see us now," she whispered. "Maybe." The cameras occasionally cut to these faces during the broadcast, the tired eyes of a nurse watching from a hospital break room, the worn expression of a shop owner standing amid the ruins of his store, the hopeful gaze of a child peering over a parent's shoulder. And there were the testimonies. The network anchors, sensing the moment's gravity, played clips gathered over the long night. A woman in uniform, her badge tarnished, stood before a burned-out squad car. Her voice trembled. "My husband's in the ICU. He was trying to protect a family trapped in a building. He didn't ask who they voted for. He didn't ask where they came from. He just did his job, and he bled for it." A man in a soot-streaked apron, his accent thick but his words clear, stood amid the wreckage of his bakery. 20 years I built this. 20 years. Gone in one night. I came here because this country gave me a chance. I still believe in it. But we need someone to fight for us." Back on stage, JD's voice, steady and unflinching, cut through the weight of grief and outrage. This is about all of us, not politics, not party, not power. It's about whether we will stand together or whether we will let fear and silence and division tear us apart. His words rippled outward, carried on airwaves and into hearts, binding together people who, until that moment, had felt alone in their sorrow. And as the debate raged on, as leaders clashed, it was the people's voice that began to rise louder than either man on stage. A chorus of those who had suffered, who demanded better, and who, at last, felt seen. The town hall had begun as a duel between two men, but as the evening wore on, it became something more, a reckoning. The stage lights seemed harsher now, the air thicker with the weight of truths that could no longer be ignored. The people's voice, lifted by heartbreak and hope, had become impossible to drown out. The moderator turned from his notes and looked directly at Governor Newsom. His tone, respectful but firm, carried the frustration of a city on edge. Governor, with respect, we've heard the calls for unity, but families have lost homes. Officers have nearly died. Small businesses are gone. Can you tell these people what specifically your administration will do tonight? Not tomorrow, not next week. To protect them? Newsom blinked under the glare of the cameras, his polished confidence faltering. He shifted in his seat, searching for words that wouldn't come. We are coordinating resources, he began, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. We are working with community leaders, and we believe in solutions that address the root causes, not just the symptoms. A murmur swept through the audience. Not applause, not protest, just the weary sound of a crowd that had heard promises before and seen little change. JD leaned forward, his voice clear, cutting through the fog of rhetoric. Governor, with respect, the root cause tonight is that our people were left to fend for themselves while their city burned. This is not a time for more panels or task forces. It's a time for action. The moderator opened the floor to citizens. The first to rise was a woman with ash streaked through her hair, her eyes red from tears. My son's in the hospital, she said, her voice shaking. He tried to help our neighbors when looters came. He was beaten so badly I didn't recognize him. What are you going to do for us? For him? Newsom's lips parted, but no answer came. The camera zoomed in, capturing the helplessness that flickered across his face. JD didn't wait. He stood, the force of the moment lifting him beyond the script, beyond politics. I'll tell you what we're going to do, JD said, his voice rising with passion. We're going to rebuild. We're going to protect those who've been failed. We're going to stand in the streets where you were abandoned and make them safe again. And I promise you this, I will not let you be forgotten. The crowd erupted, not in wild cheers, but in a wave of agreement, of relief, of shared purpose. Heads nodded, hands clapped, and voices called out in support. In that instant, JD wasn't just a senator. He was the voice of a city that had been silenced for too long. Newsom tried to recover, offering statistics, plans, future initiatives. But the momentum had shifted. The people weren't listening for promises anymore. They were listening for someone who saw them, who would stand with them, who would act. And as the cameras panned across the crowd, as faces lifted with cautious hope, JD's words lingered in the air, a promise louder than any applause. I will not let you be forgotten. The town hall ended, but for JD, the real work was just beginning. As dawn broke over the city once more, he refused to retreat to comfort or distance. Instead, he stepped into the streets, into the very heart of what had been lost. No cameras, no podiums, just boots crunching over ash and glass as he walked where the city had burned. JD moved block by block, each turn revealing another scar. A row of small shops, their awnings charred and sagging, stood like broken teeth along the avenue. The smell of smoke clung to everything. Burned-out vehicles, their frames warped by heat, dotted the streets like forgotten skeletons. He stopped at what had once been a family-owned bookstore. The sign above was blackened, its letters barely legible. Inside, the shelves had collapsed, spilling books into piles of wet ash and soot. A single children's book lay open in the debris, its pages singed but intact. A story waiting for a child who might never return to read it. JD knelt, picking it up, brushing away the ash. He felt the weight of it. Not just paper and ink, but the memory of what this place had been. A safe haven, a labor of love, now reduced to rubble. Further down the street, he met a man sweeping what remained of his barber shop. The man's hands trembled as he worked, his broom pushing more ash than dust. He spoke softly without looking up. 25 years, I cut hair here. Now look. JD put a hand on his shoulder. No words would have sufficed. Together for a moment, they stared at the ruin. And then there was the house, or what had been a house. Its frame still stood, blackened beams reaching toward the sky like the ribs of some fallen beast. JD stepped through what had been the doorway. Inside, the floor was littered with the remains of a life. Scorched furniture, a melted picture frame, the warped springs of a child's crib. A boy no older than 8 stood at the edge of the yard. His face was smudged with ash, his eyes too old for his years. In his hands, he clutched a small bundle of fabric, stars and stripes, burned at the edges, the colors dulled by soot. JD approached slowly, kneeling beside him. "Is that your flag?" The boy nodded, his lip quivering. "It was my dad's. He put it up after he got back." JD swallowed hard. Feeling the sting of tears he refused to shed. Gently, he helped the boy unfold what was left of the flag, smoothing it out as best they could. Together, they held it between them, a silent tribute to what had been lost and to what still endured. "We'll save this," JD said quietly, "and we'll save this city too." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the broken streets, JD kept walking. He listened to stories of survival and sorrow, of courage and loss. Every face he saw, every voice he heard, deepened his resolve. The city might have been battered, but it was not broken, and neither was he. The sun dipped low over Los Angeles, casting long shadows over the ruined streets. The city had survived the night, but its wounds were fresh, its people raw with grief and exhaustion. And yet, beneath the ash and debris, JD saw something else, something stronger than smoke and ruin. The quiet courage of those who had refused to let their neighbors fall. He heard it in the stories shared as he walked, of officers who held their posts against impossible odds, shielding families trapped in burning buildings, of firefighters who worked without pause, forming human chains to pass buckets when water pressure failed, of shop owners who stood shoulder to shoulder, defending what little remained from looters, of teenagers who helped guide the elderly to safety. These weren't headlines. These were lives, unsung heroes whose names wouldn't grace speeches or scroll across breaking news tickers. But to JD, they were the heart of the city's survival. As dusk deepened, JD stood at the edge of a small park, its trees blackened at the tips from the fires. Word had spread, and people gathered. Officers, firefighters, nurses, teachers, shopkeepers, children holding candles that flickered in the evening breeze. A makeshift memorial had grown at the base of a scorched oak. Photos of the fallen, handwritten notes, badges, helmets, flowers salvaged from ruined gardens. JD stepped forward, his voice low but carrying in the hush. "Tonight, we remember those who stood between this city and the dark. We remember those who chose to protect, not destroy. Those who gave everything so that others might see another sunrise." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd, meeting tear-filled eyes, bowed heads, clenched hands. "I walked your streets today. I saw the courage, the heartbreak, the hope, and I promise you this, their sacrifice will not be forgotten. We will rebuild, we will heal, and we will honor them, not just with words, but with action." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering. The candles glowed brighter against the coming night, tiny stars defying the darkness. JD let the silence speak for a moment, then added, his voice thick with emotion. "These heroes didn't ask who their neighbors voted for. They didn't ask where they were born, what language they spoke, or what faith they held. They stood for each other, and that is what will save us now." The vigil stretched on as the stars emerged, the city's sirens quieter now, the fires mostly out. And in homes across Los Angeles and far beyond, people watched, listened, and felt something shift. Public sentiment, frayed and uncertain in the days of chaos, began to coalesce. They had seen the speeches, the plans, the debates, but here in the park, lit by the glow of shared loss and shared resolve, they saw something more. Leadership that stood in the ashes, not apart from them. And as JD stepped back from the memorial, the candles casting soft light on his worn face, the city, bruised but unbroken, seemed, for the first time in days, to breathe as one. The night after the vigil, Los Angeles felt changed. The fires no longer raged. The shouts of the mobs had faded, replaced by the low murmur of neighbors clearing debris, the scrape of brooms on pavement, the creak of wood as makeshift repairs began. Amid this fragile calm, JD moved swiftly. He knew the city needed more than promises. It needed a plan. By morning, JD gathered community leaders, business owners, faith leaders, and emergency officials in a battered municipal hall. The room smelled faintly of smoke, the windows cracked, the tables scarred by years of use. But there was determination in the air, a shared hunger to act. JD spoke without notes, his voice steady, the weariness of the past night softened by resolve. We can't wait for commissions, studies, or endless debate. The people who kept this city standing deserve better. So here's what we do. Tonight. He laid it out. A rapid relief initiative using federal emergency funds and private donations to provide temporary housing, food, and medical care. Mobile units to deliver supplies directly to the hardest-hit neighborhoods. A task force blending federal and local teams to secure areas at risk of renewed violence. Grants for small businesses to reopen their doors. The plan was bold, immediate, and clear. And as JD spoke, faces that had been skeptical, even hostile days before, began to soften. Among them was Councilwoman Rivera, who had once denounced JD's involvement as grandstanding. She leaned forward now, nodding. Senator, if you mean this, if you're ready to work with us, not just over us, you'll have my backing. A pastor from South Los Angeles, who had publicly criticized JD's call for federal troops, rose slowly. I didn't think you'd show up when the cameras left, but you did. And if this is how we move forward, together, count me in. JD met their eyes, grateful but focused. This is about all of us, and it starts today. Word of the plan spread quickly. Reporters who had once questioned his motives now reported on the proposals with cautious optimism. The city's mood shifted, not to celebration, not yet, but to something sturdier. Hope. That evening, as the sky burned pink and gold over a city still healing, JD slipped away from the noise. He found himself at a small church, its stone walls scarred but standing. The front doors hung open, as if welcoming the brokenhearted. Inside it was quiet. The smell of melted wax and old wood filled the air. Candles flickered on the altar, casting soft halos of light. JD sank to one knee in a back pew, folding his hands, bowing his head. He didn't speak aloud. There were no grand declarations, no speeches, no press. Just a man, humbled by all he'd seen, seeking strength for what lay ahead. Outside, the city stirred. Hammers tapped. Voices called instructions. A flag, cleaned and patched, was raised over a rebuilt stoop. The glimmer of light JD had fought to kindle flickered to life. Fragile, but real. And as he knelt in that quiet sanctuary, JD knew the work had only begun, but for the first time it felt possible. The glimmer of hope that had begun to flicker across Los Angeles was not lost on the nation's attention, or on Governor Gavin Newsom. As JD's relief plan gained traction and scenes of citizens rebuilding filled the airwaves, the spotlight that had once shielded Newsom now burned hot with scrutiny. The media turned, no longer content with carefully worded statements or distant press briefings. Headlines grew sharper. Where was the leadership? A city saved by its people, not its governor. The rising star, Vance steps in where Newsom stayed silent. Protests gathered outside the state capitol and city offices. Some demanded action, others demanded resignation. The chants rose louder each day, echoing through the marble halls where Newsom's team met behind closed doors. Inside those rooms, tension mounted. His senior advisors were divided, their once confident strategies fraying under pressure. We have to get ahead of this, one aide urged, slamming a fist on the table. Announce a task force, propose your own relief plan. Something. Right now, Vance owns the narrative. We're losing ground by the hour. Another shook her head, her voice tight with worry. If we chase his plan, it'll look weak, reactive. We need to reframe this, remind people who their governor is, not hand the state over to a senator playing hero. Newsom rubbed his temples, the weight of the moment pressing down. His approval ratings, once comfortably high, now plummeted with every new poll. The confidence that had defined his career had given way to hesitation. Meanwhile, JD seized the moment. From the steps of City Hall, surrounded by community leaders from both sides of the aisle, he spoke not as a politician seeking points, but as a man calling for unity. This isn't about party lines, JD said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. It's about drawing the line where chaos stops and rebuilding begins. I call on every leader, Democrat, Republican, Independent, to put aside old fights. We have a city to save, a state to heal, a future to protect. The cameras captured it all. JD standing shoulder to shoulder with those who, days ago, had questioned him. The crowd beyond the barricades cheered, not out of partisanship, but out of a deep yearning for someone, anyone, to lead them out of the storm. Back in the governor's office, the advisors fell silent as they watched the broadcast. The image of JD flanked by former critics, the sounds of real, raw support from the streets, it was a stark contrast to the closed-door debates and scripted statements that had become Newsom's refuge. The governor rose slowly, looking out the tall window toward the city beyond. Fires no longer lit the night, but the flames of accountability burned hotter than ever. He knew the tide had turned. The question now was whether he would drown in it or finally find the courage to wade in. And outside those walls, Los Angeles kept rebuilding, guided not by politics, but by a shared will stronger than any single man. The city had reached its breaking point, but in that fracture, something extraordinary took root. As pressure bore down on Governor Newsom and partisan walls thinned, JD's call for unity found fertile ground. By nightfall, a coordinated effort, federal, state, and local forces moving as one, began to sweep through Los Angeles, not as an occupying force, but as a lifeline. JD stood at the mobile command center, maps spread before him, radios crackling with updates. His eyes tracked the operation's progress, sector by sector, block by block. From downtown's skeletal high-rises to the labyrinth of side streets in the outer neighborhoods, teams moved with precision and purpose. Armored vehicles rolled side by side with battered police cruisers. National Guard troops marched with city officers, their boots falling in rhythm. Fire crews and medics fanned out behind them, ready to bring aid where destruction still smoldered. JD refused to watch from a distance. He rode with the convoy, feeling the pulse of the city beneath the wheels, the heartbeat of a place determined not to fall. He saw the faces at windows, on porches, families peering out, unsure at first, then stepping forward as the chaos ebbed. In block after block, calm returned. The air, once thick with smoke and fear, began to clear. Spotlights cut through the haze, illuminating streets now free of mobs. Officers and citizens worked side by side, boarding up broken windows, hauling debris, tending to the injured. JD stepped out at one intersection where just nights before a gas station had burned. Now volunteers passed out bottled water, and a group of teenagers repainted graffiti-scarred walls. "Thank you," an older woman said, clasping his hand, tears glinting in the lamplight. "I didn't think we'd see this day." "We're just getting started," JD replied, his voice quiet but sure. The city's reclaiming wasn't without tension. Flare-ups of resistance, small pockets of defiance that had to be quelled. But the overwhelming force was one of restoration, of citizens and protectors united. At one point, JD watched as an officer handed his radio to a young man who had been guarding his apartment complex with nothing but a broom handle. "You call it in," the officer said. "You helped hold this block." The boy's hands shook as he spoke into the mic, his voice steadying with each word. From the rooftops, camera crews captured the moment. Lines of uniformed men and women, civilians at their sides, sweeping the city clean of violence. Street by street, block by block. The images beamed across the nation. Not a city conquered, but a city redeemed. By dawn, the hum of sirens had faded to the steady rhythm of rebuilding. And as JD stood watching the first rays of light spill across the skyline, he knew this wasn't the end of the fight. But it was the first true victory in a battle for the city's soul. The city awoke to a different sound that morning. Not sirens or shouts, but hammers on wood, brooms sweeping glass, voices lifted not in anger, but in determination. Los Angeles, bruised and battered, began to breathe again. And with that fragile peace came a moment that many thought they'd never see. Governor Gavin Newsom and JD Vance, standing side by side at the steps of City Hall. It had taken days of mounting pressure, sleepless nights, and the unmistakable will of the people. Newsom's advisors, once divided, had finally agreed. The governor could no longer stand apart. The joint statement, though born of necessity, became a symbol, imperfect but powerful. The cameras rolled as the two men stepped forward. Newsom's face was pale, his expression somber. J.D., though equally exhausted, stood tall, the weight of the city's journey etched in his eyes. Newsom spoke first, his words measured. "We have faced one of the darkest chapters in our city's history, but today, together, we turn a page. We commit as one government, as one people, to rebuilding, to healing, to moving forward." His voice wavered slightly, but the crowd gathered beyond the barricades listened, not for perfection, but for unity. Then J.D. stepped to the microphone. He paused, letting the moment settle, letting the city lean in. The morning light caught the soot still streaked on his sleeves, the dust on his boots, silent witnesses to the nights he'd walked these streets. "We did not just take back a city," J.D. began, his voice steady, carrying far beyond the square. "We took back who we are as a nation. This wasn't about politics or party or power. It was about standing together when it mattered most." He swept his gaze across the crowd, at firefighters with bandaged hands, at officers with tear-streaked faces, at mothers holding their children close, at shopkeepers who stood before boarded-up doors but lifted their heads high. This city bled, but it did not break, and neither did we. Because in every hand that cleared rubble, in every arm that lifted a neighbor, in every voice that said, "Not here, not now," we found what makes us who we are. The crowd was silent, caught in the grip of his words. Even the cameras seemed to draw closer, framing a man who had not just led, but walked beside them through the fire. J.D.'s voice softened, rich with emotion. "We will rebuild, yes, but more than bricks and mortar, we will rebuild trust, purpose, hope. Let this day remind us all. Cities can burn, but the American spirit does not. We prove that together." Newsom inclined his head slightly, the weight of the moment undeniable. And as J.D. stepped back from the microphone, the crowd erupted, not in wild cheers but in applause that rose like a tide, steady and sure, a sound of relief, of pride, of a people who had endured. Above them the sun climbed higher, casting long light over the city's scars and its strength alike. And as the two men stood together, however uneasily, Los Angeles felt, for the first time in many long days, the warmth of a new dawn. The applause from the joint statement had faded, replaced by the soft murmur of a city awakening to the quiet of the day after. The streets, still scarred, bore witness to the battle fought and won by a people who refused to surrender their home. But for J.D. Vance, the work was not done. The speeches had been given. Now came the hardest part, honoring those who had paid the price. As the morning sun filtered through a pale haze, J.D. moved through Los Angeles with a small group of aides and community leaders. He had no cameras trailing him, no crowd seeking sound bites. What he sought now was silence, space to remember, space to think. At a park on the city's east side, he stopped at a memorial that volunteers had built from the remnants of the violence, a circle of melted street signs, scorched wood, and shattered glass. At its center, a simple wooden cross, draped with a tattered American flag. Around it, families had left flowers, notes, photos of the loved ones they had lost. J.D. stepped forward and knelt, laying a wreath of white lilies and blue forget-me-nots at the base of the cross. His hand lingered on the wood, his head bowed. The voices of the city seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of the wind stirring the flag's frayed edges. A mother approached, her face lined by sleepless nights, her eyes red but fierce. J.D. rose to meet her. Without words, she opened her arms and he embraced her, holding tight as her body shook with grief. "My boy," she whispered. "He believed in this place, in what we are." J.D.'s voice was low, thick with emotion. "So do I, ma'am, and I swear to you, we will honor him with what we build next." They parted, but the weight of her sorrow stayed with him. At a firehouse reduced to rubble, JD stood with the families of two firefighters who had died saving children trapped in a burning apartment. The youngest widow clutched her husband's helmet, scorched but intact, as if it might still protect him. JD took her hand gently. "He was a hero," he said simply. "Your husband showed this city what courage looks like." She nodded through tears, and together they laid the helmet at a growing tribute of flowers, boots, and badges. Block by block, memorial by memorial, JD paid his respects. He knelt in prayer at a synagogue where volunteers had shielded the homeless from the flames. He bowed his head at a mosque that had opened its doors to those fleeing the chaos. He paused at murals hastily painted on boarded windows. Faces of the fallen, messages of unity scrawled in bright colors against the gray. Each stop deepened his reflections. The cost of leadership, he knew, was not measured in applause or headlines. It was measured in the eyes of those left behind, in the burden of promises made, in the silent vow to carry forward the memory of those lost. And as the sun climbed higher, casting its light over a city still wounded but unbowed, JD walked on, one man among many, bearing the weight of what had been and the hope of what could be. The day of remembrance stretched into evening, and as the city's lights flickered on, some still powered by generators, others by restored grids, a quiet expectation settled across the nation. In parks, on courthouse steps, in town squares from coast to coast, Americans gathered for a national vigil. The scars of Los Angeles had become, for a moment, the scars of a country grappling with its identity. It was at this moment that JD chose to speak, not through microphones on a stage, but through words written in the solitude of a small office overlooking the city he had helped to save. The letter, handwritten, its edges smudged by ash-streaked fingers, was entrusted to a local pastor to read aloud at the vigil. As candles glowed across the nation, the pastor's voice, steady and clear, carried JD's message. "To my fellow Americans, in the past days, we have seen fire. We have seen ruin. We have seen grief that no words can ease. But more than that, we have seen courage. The courage of neighbors who stood for each other. The courage of those who ran toward the danger, not from it. The courage of a city that would not give in." This letter is not written to one party, or one state, or one group. It is written to us all. Because what happened in Los Angeles was not just about one city. It was a mirror, showing us who we are, and who we must choose to be. We are at a crossroads. One road leads to division, to blame, to the easy comfort of thinking this is someone else's problem. The other leads to unity, to responsibility, to a shared duty to stand for what is right. I ask you now from my heart, let us choose the harder road, the better road, the American road. Let us remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. That duty is not the burden of the few, but the calling of us all. That unity is not found in speeches, but in the hands we extend to one another. In the nights ahead, the work will not be easy. Rebuilding never is. But we will rebuild, not just bricks and mortar, but trust, hope, and the belief that this nation's best days are not behind us, but ahead. To the families who lost loved ones, know this: we see you, we grieve with you, and we will honor their memory with action worthy of their sacrifice. To the children who watch their world shake, know this: we will steady it again, and we will make it stronger so that you may inherit a country worthy of your dreams. And to every American who wonders if their voice matters, who fears their neighbor, or questions whether unity is possible, I say, look around. Look at the hands rebuilding homes. Look at the arms lifting up the fallen. Look at the candles burning tonight in every town and city. We are not lost, not if we stand together. Let tonight mark the beginning of a new chapter, written by us all, in the ink of our shared sacrifice and hope. Yours in duty and in faith, J.D. Vance. As the pastor's voice fell silent, the crowd stood still, the weight of the words settling over them. Candles swayed gently in the night breeze, and across the nation, Americans exhaled. Not in relief, but in renewed purpose. Days turned quietly into weeks. And Los Angeles, once choked by smoke and sorrow, began to pulse with life again. The scars of the past lingered, etched into walls and hearts, but they no longer defined the city. Parks once littered with ash rang with the laughter of children chasing one another beneath freshly painted swings. Trees, their branches blackened, now sprouted green shoots, a promise of resilience. Storefronts that had stood shattered now reopened, their windows clean, their doors flung wide in welcome. Signs of hope replaced boards of fear. We're back, stronger together. Street corners once guarded by barricades were now held by neighbors sharing coffee, conversation, and plans for what came next. And through it all, JD walked, not with an entourage, not with cameras at his back, but alone, his steps slow and steady through a city he had come to know street by street, face by face. The morning air was cool, crisp, carrying the scent of fresh wood from rebuilt homes and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. As he passed City Hall, he paused, lifting his gaze to where the American flag flew high above the square. The fabric rippled in the soft breeze, its colors bright against the pale blue sky, a simple, steady reminder of all that had been fought for and all that had been reclaimed. JD stood there a long moment, letting the stillness settle, letting the weight of the journey fall away. Around him, the city stirred, not in chaos, but in quiet purpose, the hum of a people who had remembered their strength. And as he turned, the words rose in his heart, as sure and steady as the flag above. We remembered who we are. This story reminds us that true leadership is not about titles or power, but about standing with people when it matters most. JD's journey through the ashes of a broken city shows how unity, courage, and compassion can rebuild more than buildings. They can restore hope. In moments of crisis, will we choose to lift one another up or look away? What would you want your community to remember about who we are? Let's reflect together. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.